The funny thing about flying home after 8 months overseas is you expect jet lag, maybe a weird baggage claim drama, not pulling into your own driveway, and realizing someone misplaced an entire wing of your house. Like, not damaged, not vandalized, gone, as in congratulations, ma'am, your guest wing has been deleted. And the cherry on top, a neon yellow notice stapled to what was left of my front door, like my house had gotten a parking ticket from the HOA. I landed in Nashville at 6:15 a.m. on March 3rd, 2025, dead tired but proud. Dubai was done, the project delivered on time, under budget by $4 million, the kind of win you don't even celebrate properly because you're too exhausted to lift your arms. All I wanted was coffee on my deck, that quiet lake air, that feeling where your brain finally stops sprinting and starts walking again. I cleared the airport, grabbed my bags, drove south, and watched the Tennessee countryside roll by in that gray early morning light. Bare trees, low fog, the world still half asleep. I'd made the drive to Lakeview Heights 100 times, maybe more, and every time it felt like decompression, like the road was wringing the stress out of my shoulders mile by mile. Then I turned onto Lakeview Drive, came around the final bend, and I hit the brakes so hard my chest tightened. Because my guest wing was gone. Not there's a hole in the roof, not a window got smashed, not even someone stole the copper piping, gone. The entire 2,400 square feet on the east side of my property, 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a full kitchen, that covered porch looking out over the lake reduced to a bare concrete foundation, and a pile of rubble that looked like a tornado had a personal grudge. And the main house, my 9,400 square foot lake mansion, the original developer's residence built in 1962, that I'd spent 2 years restoring with period-accurate materials, was ripped open like a can. 30% demolished. The east wing torn clean apart. I could see rooms exposed to open air, my study, a guest bedroom, the hallway with that oak paneling I spent 4 months sourcing because I'm ridiculous and I care about the details. The place smelled like dust and cut timber, and that sharp, dry stink demolition leaves behind even weeks later. I just sat there for a full minute with the engine running, hands on the wheel, staring like my brain was trying to buffer the scene into something that made sense. Then I got out, walked through the construction fencing. No lock, just a latch, like whoever did this wasn't worried about consequences, and I stepped onto what used to be my guest wing. The foundation was still solid, that old-school concrete poured to last a century, but everything above it was rubble. I could see broken fragments of custom tile I'd imported from Portugal, pieces of hand-built cabinetry I'd commissioned from a woodworker in Asheville smashed and mixed with drywall dust like it didn't matter. I did what I've done for 30 years in real estate development. When something goes sideways, I documented. Wide shots, medium shots, close-ups. The exposed interior, the rubble pile, the fencing, the warning notices, and then I saw it, stapled to what remained of my front door. A yellow notice, official-looking, weathered by March rain. Delinquent dues unpaid 8 months, authorized demolition. Signed by the HOA president, Karen Hollis. I read it once, twice, 3 times because my dues were current. Autopay, 6 years straight, like clockwork. I hadn't missed a payment, not once. And yet here was a piece of paper basically saying, "Sorry for the inconvenience, we bulldozed your home because our spreadsheet told us you were naughty." That's when I called Richard Cole, my property attorney of 14 years, the man who handled the Lakeview Heights acquisition back in 2019, structured the whole Blackwood Capital Holdings purchase, reviewed every ground lease, every easement, every clause people don't read until their life is on fire. He answered on the second ring, cheerful like he didn't know my morning had turned into a disaster movie. "Tori, you're back. How was?" "They demolished my house." Silence, the kind that drops like a heavy curtain. "Say that again." "Lakeview Heights, HOA issued a demolition order while I was in Dubai. Guest wing is gone. Main structure is partially demolished. There's a notice on my door signed by Karen Hollis." Another silence, longer this time. "Are you at the property right now?" "Standing in the rubble." "Don't touch anything. Don't move anything. Don't speak to anyone from the HOA. I'm leaving in 20 minutes. And then he hung up, which is how you know it's bad. Richard doesn't hang up on anybody unless the law is about to start doing push-ups. While I waited, I stood there and thought about how I ended up here, and why this whole thing was about to go nuclear in a way Karen Hollis couldn't even imagine. Because Lakeview Heights isn't a normal neighborhood. It's a ground lease community, built in 1962 by a developer named Harold Whitfield. either a visionary or a greedy genius depending on your mood. He sold people the houses, but he kept the land. The homeowners own their structures, walls, roofs, foundations, fixtures, but they lease the ground beneath them. And when Whitfield's estate sold assets in 2019, I bought the master deed. All 847 acres. Every road. Every common area. The lake. The shoreline. The land beneath all 340 homes, including Karen Hollis's. So yes, Karen had just demolished my home, on my land, while living on land she leased from my company. You know that feeling when someone picks a fight with a stranger at a bar, and it turns out the stranger owns the bar, the building, and the parking lot? Yeah, that. Richard arrived around 10:30 a.m., walked the property with me in silence, his face tightening the more he took in. He's methodical, not dramatic, but even he finally muttered, "This is extraordinary." "How bad?" I asked. He exhaled slowly. "They destroyed private property without proper legal process, without verifying ownership, without proper notice. This isn't HOA overreach, Tory. This is destruction. Potentially criminal depending on how the contractor was engaged." "What's the exposure?" He started listing numbers like he was reading a menu. Guest wing replacement. Main structure repairs. Diminution of value. Loss of use. Punitive damages, because this wasn't an accident, this was reckless. $6 million to start, he said, and it could go higher. The HOA doesn't have $6 million. Richard's eyes flicked toward me. "No, but you have something they do have." And we both said it at the same time, like a grim little duet. The ground leases. We went to the HOA clubhouse at noon. Pretty building, timber construction, great view of the lake sitting on land I owned, of course. Karen was in the main office, early 50s, perfectly dressed, wearing that special kind of confidence you get when you've been in charge of a neighborhood long enough to confuse it with being in charge of the universe. She stood up like she'd been waiting for her moment. "Mrs. Blackwood. Miss Blackwood. Or Tory. I'm not married." I sat down without being invited, and I didn't smile. "You demolished my house." She didn't flinch. "We issued a demolition order on a delinquent property that had been abandoned for 8 months. We followed proper procedure under the bylaws. My dues are paid. Auto pay. Blackwood Capital Holdings. You sent notices to the wrong address while I was overseas." Karen frowned at her computer like it had betrayed her. "We have no record of payments from an entity by that name. Check August 12, 2024, $2,847.50. She clicked around, and I watched the flicker cross her face, recognition trying to become alarm, but not quite getting there yet. "That payment," she said slowly, "was recorded as an unidentified commercial payment. It wasn't matched to a property account. And there it was. The whole reason my home was rubble because an accounting system couldn't match a corporate name to a property account, and instead of making a phone call, someone chose a bulldozer." I leaned forward, voice calm, because calm is scarier than yelling. "Karen, you demolished a multi-million-dollar structure on land that I own, and I own considerably more than that parcel." Her eyes sharpened. "What does that mean?" "It means you should have your attorney pull the master deed." I left my business card on her desk and walked out, and I swear I could feel her confidence wobble behind me like a bad Jenga tower. The next morning, she called at 9:17 a.m. I was on the intact portion of my deck with coffee, staring at the exposed framing where the east wing used to be, letting the anger settle into something sharper than rage, certainty. "Miss Blackwood," Karen said, and her voice had changed. Still formal, still trying to sound in control, but there was a tightness underneath it, a crack. "Our attorney reviewed the master deed situation. He'd like to meet with you and the board." 11 o'clock, I said. I walked into that conference room with Richard, and the board was assembled. 8 people, Karen at the head, and at the far end a man I didn't know, Philip Garrett, HOA attorney, gray suit, wire-rimmed glasses. Yellow legal pad packed with notes like he'd been up all night reading documents that made him regret his career choices. He confirmed it all out loud. Blackwood Capital Holdings purchased the master deed in October 2019. The land belongs to us. The homeowners lease it. The ground lease terms have been in effect since 1962. The room went dead quiet. Then Karen, in pure disbelief, said, "That can't be right. These people have deeds. They have mortgages. They have deeds to their structures," Philip said carefully, "not the land." And that's when the twist I didn't expect walked into the room, like a ghost with paperwork. A board member named Robert Marsh cleared his throat and slid a document across the table. "For the record," he said, I voted against the demolition order. Twice. I submitted a written objection and resigned on January 15th. Then another board member, Patricia Walsh, pulled out her own resignation letter dated January 17th. I told Karen we hadn't verified ownership, she said quietly. I was told I was being obstructionist. Karen stared at them like they'd pulled knives. You're protecting yourselves, she snapped. We're telling the truth, Robert said. We told you to stop. I watched Karen's authority evaporate in real time. And here's the thing. Power is loud until it meets paper. Contracts, deeds, recorded documents. The boring stuff people ignore until it's too late. Richard laid it out clean. Because the HOA, under Karen's direction, damaged property owned by the ground lessor, the board members who voted for that demolition were in material breach of their ground leases. And under those leases, we had remedies, serious remedies. Sandra Vickers, one of the loudest community standards people, turned pale. What does that mean for our mortgages? Richard didn't sugarcoat it. Termination can trigger acceleration clauses. Lenders can call loans due. The panic in that room was thick enough to chew. Karen tried to regain ground. She can't terminate 340 leases. She doesn't need to, Richard said, almost pleasantly. Just the ones in breach. Everyone slowly turned their heads toward Karen, and for the first time, she looked small. What do you want? She asked me, voice tight. I kept my tone low. What I want is my house back, which you can't give me. So now my attorney will communicate with yours. I stood, and before I left, I gave her the truth she deserved. I've been patient for 6 years. I maintained the lake, the roads, the common areas because I believed in this place. And while I was overseas working 14-hour days, you demolished my home because your system couldn't match a corporate name and you couldn't be bothered to pick up a phone. Then I walked out, and the air outside felt better, like the building itself had been holding its breath. Richard sent the lease review notices a week later, certified mail, tailored to each board member's lease, citing the exact breach clause. Karen got hers first, overnight, because I wanted her to feel the ground shift before anyone else even heard the rumble. She called me 7 minutes after it was delivered. You cannot be serious. I'm very serious. This is extortion. No, I said, and I smiled even though she couldn't see it. Extortion is threatening something you have no right to do. This is contract law. You signed it. You ignored it. Now it's reading you back your own choices. Within hours, the community found out, because secrets in a 340-home neighborhood last about as long as ice cream in August. My phone blew up with voicemails, fear, anger, confusion, a couple people apologizing because they'd watched demolition equipment roll in and said nothing, and then an emergency meeting got called, and from what I heard afterward, it was 3 hours of residents demanding to know why Karen thought abandoned meant bulldoze first, ask questions never. A petition circulated for her resignation. It passed the "this is embarrassing" mark and sprinted straight into get-out territory. Karen's response was to file suit, which, honestly, was like watching someone try to fight a house fire with a squirt gun. She argued HOA bylaws gave demolition authority, that I'd implicitly consented by paying dues, that my lease notices were interference, and then we ended up in front of Judge Warren Holloway. Karen's attorney gave a polished speech about community governance and standards, and the judge cut through it with one question that landed like a hammer. Can HOA bylaws grant demolition authority over structures on land the HOA doesn't own? Yes or no? Her attorney tried to dance. The judge didn't let him. The answer is no, he said flatly. Appearances don't override property law. He denied Karen's request to block the lease review, ordered full documentation for damages, demanded board meeting minutes, including the dissenting votes and resignations, and by the time we got to the damages hearing, it felt less like a debate and more like a slow, inevitable accounting. We brought invoices, restoration estimates, contractor testimony, photos. Every splinter had a receipt. On May 2nd, Judge Holloway issued his ruling. $6 million in compensatory damages. And here's the part that made my coffee taste a little sweeter. He found Karen's conduct willful and reckless, and he hit her with personal punitive damages $1.2 million. The HOA's reserves, $380,000, got seized immediately. Accounts frozen. Operations crippled. The HOA started dissolving because it couldn't function with a $6 million judgment hanging over its head like a guillotine. Karen filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy, probably thinking she could wash the whole thing away except her house, her precious house, was tied to the ground lease she'd breached. 2 days after her filing, Richard sent the formal termination notice, perfectly timed, perfectly legal, grounded in the court's findings. Her lenders saw their collateral drop off a cliff and called the loan due. And just like that, the woman who loved rules and punishments and community standards learned what it feels like when the rules are real, when the paper actually matters, when the ground beneath your feet has an owner, and it's not you. She listed her home for sale as structure only, no land rights, and nobody wanted it. Not because they weren't sympathetic, but because who buys a house you may not legally be able to keep sitting where it sits? Eventually she sold it for salvage value, moved out quietly, no goodbye post, no farewell speech, just a moving truck and a closed door. Meanwhile, the 6 board members who voted with her most took my settlement offer, paid personal contributions, signed acknowledgments, kept their leases. One guy tried to fight, settled later for more. The community, exhausted and embarrassed, formed a negotiating committee led by, of all people, Robert Marsh, the guy who resigned and tried to stop this before it happened. And that's where the lesson hit me, not in some inspirational quote kind of way, but in a quiet, bitter realization I didn't love admitting. I had been the quiet owner, the passive ground lessor, assuming disclosure documents were enough, assuming adults read what they sign, assuming people understand what they own, and that silence left space for someone like Karen to fill it with ego. Power loves a vacuum. Ignorance grows best in quiet. So I negotiated new lease documents in plain language, required clear disclosures, built protections that kept everyone honest, and insisted on an annual community meeting. Because if I'd been clearer from the start, maybe Karen wouldn't have had 8 months' worth of fantasy authority to play with. Still, karma doesn't care about maybe. By October 2025, a crane was lifting fresh timber into place where my guest wing used to be. And I made one decision that felt petty, and also felt like therapy. Dale, my project manager, said, "We can rebuild it exactly the way it was." I took a sip of coffee, looked at the foundation, and said, "No bigger." We rebuilt the guest wing at 3,200 square feet, 800 more than before, matching the original architecture, so perfectly it looked like it always belonged there, like the house had simply grown into itself. Karen bulldozed 2,400 square feet and accidentally funded my upgrade. By the time Richard came over one November evening, bourbon in his hand, staring at the finished east wing, he chuckled and said, "Only you would find an upside in having your house demolished." I leaned back, listened to the lake water barely moving, and I said the only thing that really mattered. I didn't destroy Karen's life. Karen destroyed Karen's life. She made a decision without checking records, without reading contracts, without listening to the 2 people begging her to slow down, and she thought authority was the same thing as ownership. Because that's the truth people hate until they need it. Your title doesn't matter, your confidence doesn't matter, your little clipboard and your bylaws don't matter if the law says the ground under your feet belongs to someone else. So here's the question I can't stop thinking about, and I want you to argue with me in the comments. Where's the line between defending your rights and going too far, and if someone bulldozes your home through bureaucratic incompetence, do they deserve mercy? Or do they deserve the full weight of the consequences? Tell me what you think is right and what you think is revenge, and if you've ever had a run-in with an HOA, a landlord, a boss, anyone who confused authority with power, drop your story. I promise you're not the only one.